Daniel Reyes did not expect to lose an argument about a star. He sat in a small gray room on the top floor of the United Nations building in Geneva, staring at a screen that showed a message from an organization most people on Earth had never heard of. The Trade Assembly, a group that claimed to manage the resources of the whole galaxy, from empty rocks to burning suns and everything in between. For years, humans had known aliens existed. First contact had happened almost 30 years ago, and since then, Earth had slowly joined a web of trade routes, treaties, and rules written by species far older than mankind. Daniel had spent most of his career trying to make sure Earth was treated fairly in that web. Today, he was failing. The message was simple, and that was what made it so insulting. It said that the sun, the very star that had given birth to every living thing on Earth, had been sold. Not damaged, not stolen. Sold, through a legal process, to a business called the Harrow Combine. The message explained, in calm and official language, that Earth had never filed the correct paperwork to claim ownership of its own star under galactic law. Because of this, the star had been listed as unclaimed property, available to any species advanced enough to make use of it. The Harrow Combine had simply paid the fee and taken the deed. Daniel read the message 3 times before he let himself react. Then he stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "They can't do this," he said to the empty room, though he already knew that, according to their laws, they could. Word spread fast. Within hours, world leaders were calling each other in a panic. Markets shook. News channels argued about what it meant to have your own sun owned by someone else. Would humans have to pay for sunlight? Could the Harrow Combine really block access to solar energy? Was this some kind of joke, or the start of something far more serious? Daniel was sent, along with 2 other diplomats, to represent Earth at an emergency session of the Trade Assembly, held on a massive space station that orbited a distant star humans had never even given a name to. The station was enormous, built from metal and glass and something that glowed faintly blue, holding thousands of delegates from hundreds of different species. Daniel had been there before, but this time, walking through its long, curved hallways, he felt smaller than ever. Inside the main chamber, delegates from different worlds sat in rows that curved around a central stage. Some had 4 arms. Some had no visible eyes. Some communicated using clicks and colors instead of words. All of them turned to look, in their own strange way, when the human delegation entered. A representative of the Harrow Combine stood at the podium. It was tall and thin, with skin that shimmered slightly under the lights, and it spoke in a smooth, almost friendly voice that made Daniel's skin crawl. "We understand this news may be difficult for young species to accept," it said, "but rules exist to keep order across the galaxy. Your star was, by definition, unclaimed. We have simply corrected an oversight. Going forward, any use of solar energy by Earth, including natural sunlight falling upon your planet, will require a licensing fee payable to the Harrow Combine." Laughter rippled through parts of the chamber. Not cruel laughter, but the kind of laughter people give when they think something is obviously absurd and obviously true at the same time. Many species had seen young civilizations struggle like this before. It happened often. A new species arrived on the galactic stage, made a mistake, and paid for it, sometimes for generations. Daniel stepped up to speak, forcing his voice to stay calm even though his hands were shaking slightly at his sides. "With respect," he said, "the sun is not simply a resource. It is the foundation of every living thing on our planet. Billions of people depend on it every single day. You cannot sell something that a species is already using to survive." The Harrow Combine representative tilted its head, almost sympathetically. And yet, that is exactly how galactic law works. Ownership rules do not consider dependence. They consider paperwork. "I am sorry your species did not understand this sooner." The chamber fell into a tense silence, waiting for Earth's reply. Daniel felt the weight of billions of people resting on his next words, and for a moment, he had no idea what to say. He glanced toward the other human delegates beside him, then back at the alien crowd. "We will need time to respond properly," he finally said. "This is a serious matter, and Earth intends to handle it seriously." The Harrow Combine representative smiled, in the same easy way someone smiles when they already believe they have won. "Take your time. The invoice will still be waiting." Delegates began speaking quietly to each other as the session moved on to other matters, treating Earth's crisis as nothing more than an interesting footnote in a very long day. Daniel walked back through the station's long hallways with his fists clenched, humiliation burning in his chest. But what none of them in that chamber knew, what none of the confident, amused aliens filling that room could have guessed, was that Earth had not been caught unprepared. Not really. For years, quietly and without announcement, a small group of scientists, engineers, and military planners back on Earth had been working on something unusual, something officially explained to the public as a clean energy project. It had never been about energy alone. As Daniel boarded the shuttle back toward Earth, he pulled out a small secure device and typed a short message to a contact he trusted more than almost anyone else in his government. "They think they own our star," he wrote. "Let's show them what happens when they try to touch it." Millions of kilometers away, in a heavily guarded facility beneath the mountains of Colorado, a woman named Helen Marsh read that message on her screen and allowed herself a small, tired smile. It was time.
10 years before the sun was ever sold, a young engineer named Helen Marsh sat alone in a laboratory late at night, watching numbers scroll across a screen, and quietly wondering if anyone would ever believe her warning. Helen had joined the Solar Research Division shortly after Earth's first real contact with alien civilizations. Back then, most people believed that meeting other species would bring peace, knowledge, and endless opportunity. Helen was not so sure. She had studied how older species treated younger ones in every historical record humans had been given access to, and a pattern kept repeating itself. New species were rarely welcomed as equals. They were usually tested, measured, and sometimes taken advantage of, until they either grew strong enough to defend themselves or were quietly pushed aside. She remembered the meeting where she first proposed her idea. It was not popular. "You want to build something that can block sunlight from our own star?" one official had asked her, half laughing, half concerned. "That sounds more like a threat to us than a defense." Helen had stood her ground. It is not about blocking sunlight from ourselves. It is about controlling who else can use it. If we are ever pressured, threatened, or taken advantage of because of our star, we need a way to respond that does not involve war. It took years of careful arguing, quiet political support, and more than a few closed-door meetings before her idea was approved, hidden inside a much larger, publicly announced program. To the world, it was called the Solar Shield Initiative, a peaceful project meant to study clean energy collection using satellites placed near the sun. Only a small circle of people knew its true purpose. Officially, it did not even have the name Helen used for it in her private notes. She called it Project Shroud. The idea was simple in concept, but incredibly difficult to build. Thousands of small satellites, each equipped with adjustable solar shutters, would be placed in a wide formation around the sun individually. They were nothing special. Together, they could be commanded to open or close in patterns, controlling how much sunlight escaped outward in specific directions, without meaningfully affecting the sunlight reaching Earth itself. It was less like turning off a light, and more like slowly closing a set of massive blinds, aimed carefully outward into space. Helen worked alongside a small, trusted team, led on the military side by Admiral Grace Okafor, a sharp, no-nonsense officer who had spent years defending Earth's early space stations from pirates and minor territorial disputes with newly met alien traders. Grace was not a scientist, but she understood strategy better than anyone Helen had ever met. "If this ever activates," Grace told her during one of their early meetings, "it means diplomacy has already failed. I want it built strong enough that we never have to explain ourselves twice." Together, they oversaw a project that grew larger every year, funded through careful government budgets disguised as clean energy research, built using materials mined from asteroids and Earth's own industrial output. Helen personally reviewed every satellite design, every shutter mechanism, every line of controlling software, determined that nothing in the system could fail at the wrong moment. The work was not easy. There were setbacks. An early prototype satellite malfunctioned and drifted dangerously close to a communications relay, nearly causing a public relations disaster that would have exposed the project's true purpose. Funding was cut twice, only to be quietly restored after private briefings with top government officials who understood exactly what was at stake. Helen aged visibly during those years, her hair turning grey long before her 40th birthday, but she never stopped believing the project mattered. There were quiet moments too, ones Helen remembered fondly even during the hardest years. Late nights in the lab with her small team, sharing simple meals while debugging control systems. The first time a full test formation of 1,000 satellites successfully opened and closed together, exactly on command, filling her monitoring screens with clean, perfectly synchronized data. She remembered crying a little that night, not from sadness, but from relief. By the time the full array was finally completed, it contained over 100,000 satellites, spread in a careful formation designed to selectively influence solar output along key directions in space, particularly toward common trade and shipping routes used by outside civilizations. It was, without question, the largest and most secretive construction project in human history. Grace insisted on running full readiness drills every few months, treating the system with the same seriousness as a nuclear deterrent. "We are not building a weapon," she often reminded her officers. "We are building a lock. But a lock only works if you are willing to use it." Helen agreed, though she quietly hoped they would never have to. The completion of the array happened almost exactly 3 weeks before news broke that the sun itself had been sold to an alien company called the Harrow Combine. At first, Helen assumed it was a strange coincidence. Later, she would learn that certain individuals within Earth's government had quietly accelerated diplomatic tensions once they realized Project Shroud was finally ready, though she never confirmed exactly how much of it had been planned. When Daniel Reyes's short, urgent message arrived on her screen following the disastrous assembly meeting, Helen did not feel fear. She felt something closer to purpose. She called Grace immediately, their conversation brief and steady. "They think they bought something they can take from us," Helen said. "Let them try," Grace replied. "Bring the array to full readiness." Quietly. Helen began typing commands into her console, watching as status lights across her monitoring room slowly shifted from standby to active, one section at a time. Far above Earth, spread out silently across millions of kilometers of space, over 100,000 satellites began to stir, preparing for a duty they had never yet performed. For the first time in 10 years, Helen allowed herself to imagine the moment they might actually be needed. She did not have to imagine much longer.
The first invoice arrived exactly 9 days after the assembly meeting, and it made grown government officials laugh out loud in disbelief. It appeared quietly in the inbox of Earth's Solar Trade Office, formatted in the strange, overly formal style used across most assembly business documents. It listed a charge for something called basic solar access, calculated based on estimated sunlight exposure across Earth's surface over the previous week. The number at the bottom was almost meaningless to human economies, an amount so large that no country on the planet could realistically pay it, even if every government combined their entire yearly budgets. Daniel Reyes stared at the number for a long time after it was forwarded to him. Then he set his tablet down, rubbed his eyes, and allowed himself a short, humorless laugh. "They actually expect us to pay this," he muttered. He was not surprised. During his years working with the assembly, he had learned that many older species did not fully understand what it meant to be a young civilization, struggling with limited resources spread across a single planet. To them, a bill like this was routine business. To Earth, it was an impossible demand disguised as a legal formality. Publicly, Earth's response was carefully worded. Officials announced that the invoice was under review, and that Earth intended to pursue formal arbitration through proper assembly channels, a process that could realistically take months, sometimes years, to complete. It was a delay tactic, and everyone involved knew it. Privately, government leaders authorized Daniel to stall for as long as possible, buying time while Project Shroud quietly moved from readiness into its first careful test phase. Helen Marsh had insisted on this approach from the very beginning. "We should not jump straight to a full shutdown," she explained to a small group of officials gathered in a secure briefing room. "If we suddenly cut off all outward solar transmission, the Combine will immediately understand what happened, and they will respond with force before we are fully prepared. We need something smaller, something that confuses them first." Her plan was simple but clever. Rather than dimming the entire star's output, Project Shroud would begin adjusting sunlight only along a few specific transit routes, corridors of space commonly used by ships that relied on gravitational assistance from the sun to travel efficiently between systems. Many trading vessels, including several owned by the Harrow Combine, used these routes regularly to save fuel and travel time. Over the following weeks, ships using those routes began experiencing strange, unexplained problems. Solar charging systems that normally operated at full efficiency suddenly produced less power than expected, Navigation systems that relied on precise measurements of solar radiation reported inconsistent readings. Some smaller vessels, caught in slightly weaker gravitational slingshot effects than their systems predicted, arrived at their destinations later than scheduled, burning extra fuel to correct their paths. At first, no one suspected Earth. The idea that a young, recently contacted species could somehow influence the output of its own star seemed almost impossible to older civilizations, who still viewed humans as barely capable of managing basic interstellar trade. Engineers and scientists working for the Harrow Combine spent weeks investigating the strange irregularities, blaming solar flares, equipment malfunctions, or simple bad luck. Daniel used the growing confusion to his advantage during a follow-up assembly session held to discuss Earth's continued failure to pay its solar invoice. We understand there have been some unusual difficulties reported by vessels traveling near our system recently, he said carefully, standing at the podium with practiced calm. Naturally, we hope this is unrelated to the current dispute over ownership. Star behavior can be difficult to predict, even for advanced civilizations. A few delegates exchanged uncertain glances. The Harrow Combine representative, the same smooth-voiced figure from the first meeting, narrowed its eyes slightly, though its tone remained composed. "We are investigating the cause," it said. "We do not yet believe it is connected to your dispute." "Of course," Daniel replied smoothly. "We would never suggest otherwise." Behind the scenes, however, suspicions slowly began to grow. A junior analyst working for the Combine, reviewing months of solar activity data, noticed that the irregular patterns seemed to align a little too perfectly with specific shipping lanes, rather than appearing randomly across the system as natural solar activity normally would. The analyst raised the concern to superiors, who dismissed it at first, unwilling to believe that a young species like humanity could possess such advanced control over its own star. Meanwhile, Earth continued stalling through official channels, requesting additional documentation, questioning the legality of the original sale, and formally challenging whether proper notice had been given to Earth's government before the deed was transferred. None of these arguments were expected to succeed. They were simply meant to slow things down. Every extra week bought valuable time for Helen's team to expand their control of the array, testing new formations, refining their ability to adjust output with greater precision, and preparing contingency plans in case the Harrow Combine escalated the situation by force. Admiral Grace Okafor used the same period to quietly reposition several of Earth's defense fleets, spreading them out under the cover of routine training exercises, careful not to raise alarm. She personally reviewed simulations predicting how the Combine might respond if their suspicions were confirmed, preparing for outcomes ranging from formal legal action to outright military pressure. "They will not simply accept losing access without a fight," she warned during one strategy session. "When they realize what we've done, they will try to take it back by force. We need to be ready before that happens, not after." Daniel understood the risk clearly. Every week of delay bought Earth more preparation time, but it also increased the chance that the Harrow Combine would grow impatient, or worse, uncover the truth before Earth was fully ready to respond. That moment arrived sooner than anyone had hoped. During a private Combine strategy meeting, held far from human eyes, the same junior analyst who had first noticed the irregular patterns presented a detailed report connecting nearly all of the recent disruptions directly to the region surrounding Earth's Sunday. The report was met with stunned silence, followed by outrage. Within days, the Harrow Combine formally accused Earth of illegally interfering with legally purchased property, demanding immediate compliance and full payment of all outstanding invoices. When Earth refused to respond with anything more than continued diplomatic delays, the Combine made its decision. An enforcement fleet was ordered to Earth's solar system, tasked with seizing direct control of solar collection infrastructure by force, regardless of Earth's objections. News of the approaching fleet reached Daniel late at night, delivered through an urgent, heavily encrypted message. He read it once, then immediately contacted Helen and Grace through a secure line, his voice steady despite the seriousness of the moment. "They're coming," he said simply. On the other end, Helen glanced toward her monitoring screens, watching the steady, glowing status lights representing over 100,000 satellites spread silently across the solar system. "Then it's time they learn," she said quietly. Exactly what they tried to buy. Grace Okafor had spent most of her career preparing for a fight she hoped would never actually happen, and now, standing in the command center of Earth's primary defense station, she finally watched it begin. The Harrow Combine's enforcement fleet appeared on long-range sensors 3 days after Daniel's warning, a formation of heavily armed ships moving steadily toward Earth's solar system with clear intent. Grace studied the readouts carefully, counting ship classes, estimating weapon strength, and calculating how much time remained before the fleet crossed into a range where it could realistically threaten Earth or its orbital infrastructure. They are not hiding their approach, she said to her second-in-command, a calm, steady officer standing beside her. They want us to see them coming. They want us to be afraid. She refused to give them that satisfaction. Grace immediately contacted Daniel and Helen through a secure channel, gathering them together for what all three understood would likely be the most important decision of their careers. We have maybe 70 hours before their fleet reaches effective range, Grace explained. After that, they will attempt to seize direct control of our orbital solar collectors and possibly threaten surface targets if we resist. Daniel's voice was tense but controlled. Diplomatically, we are out of options. They've stopped responding to arbitration requests entirely. Helen took a slow breath before speaking. Then we activate Project Shroud fully. Not partial adjustments this time. A complete outward shutdown, focused entirely on cutting off any solar energy transmission usable by the Combine, while preserving full sunlight here at home. There was a heavy pause across the line. Everyone understood what this decision truly meant. It was no longer a quiet test or a subtle bargaining tactic. It was a direct, undeniable act of defiance against a fleet already moving to enforce a legal claim recognized by nearly the entire galaxy. If we do this, Grace said carefully, there is no pretending afterward. They will know exactly what we are capable of. They already suspect, Helen replied. It's time they understand completely. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the enormous weight resting on his next words. Then he opened them, steady and certain. Do it. Deep beneath the mountains of Colorado, Helen sat at her main control console, surrounded by a small trusted team who had worked alongside her for years. She entered a long sequence of security codes, confirming her identity twice before the system allowed her to proceed. On the massive display in front of her, a simplified diagram of the solar system glowed softly, showing the sun at its center, surrounded by a faint, nearly invisible ring representing the full deployment pattern of over 100,000 satellites. Beginning full activation sequence, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. Across millions of kilometers of space, the satellites of Project Shroud responded almost instantly. What had once been a slow, careful adjustment along limited trade routes now became something far larger. Shutters across the entire outward-facing side of the array began closing in a wide, coordinated pattern, redirecting and containing solar radiation that would normally have spread freely outward into deep space. To anyone watching from far outside Earth's solar system, the effect was strange and unmistakable. The sun, still shining brightly for anyone standing on Earth's surface, began visibly dimming when viewed from certain external angles, as though someone had reached out and slowly closed a curtain across half the sky. Aboard the approaching Harrow Combined fleet, alarms began sounding almost immediately. Solar charging systems, relied upon to keep several of their ships powered during long-range travel, suddenly reported severe power loss. Navigation systems, calibrated using precise solar radiation measurements, struggled to adjust to the sudden, unexplained change. Smaller support vessels, dependent entirely on solar collection panels for basic operation, began losing power rapidly, drifting out of formation as their systems failed one by one. The fleet's commanding officer, a tall, armored figure with cold, calculating eyes, stared at the reports flooding across his command console in disbelief. "This is not possible," he said sharply. "No young species has the technology to influence a star's output on this scale." But the evidence sat plainly before him. Ship after ship reported failing systems, stranded engines, and dangerously low power reserves. Within hours, nearly a third of his fleet had been forced to halt entirely, unable to safely continue their advance toward Earth. Back on Earth, Celebrations were quiet, but deeply felt. In the Colorado facility, Helen watched as her monitoring screens confirmed exactly what she had spent 10 years preparing for. Solar output directed toward the approaching fleet's projected path had dropped dramatically, while sensors confirmed that sunlight reaching Earth itself remained completely unaffected, steady and warm as it had always been. Grace allowed herself a small, satisfied smile as she watched the enemy fleets advance slow, then stall entirely. They came expecting an easy victory, she said. Instead, they found a locked door. Daniel, watching the unfolding events from a secure communications room, felt something he had not felt since this entire crisis began. A small, cautious sense of hope. Word of what had happened spread quickly across galactic communication networks, reaching far beyond the stranded fleet itself. Rumors and confirmed reports mixed together as merchants, diplomats, and curious observers across dozens of species tried to understand exactly what had occurred. A young, recently contacted species had somehow gained the ability to control access to its own star, defying not only a legally recognized business claim, but the authority of the Trade Assembly itself. For the first time in recorded galactic history, a developing civilization had denied older, more powerful species access to a resource they had legally purchased and had done so successfully. The Harrow Combine's commanding officer, humiliated and furious, sent an urgent report back to Combine leadership, demanding immediate reinforcements and authorization for direct military action against Earth's home system. Meanwhile, an emergency session of the Trade Assembly was hastily called, its members eager, and more than a little nervous, to understand exactly what humanity had done and what it might mean for the rest of the galaxy. Daniel Reyes barely had time to catch his breath before receiving the summons. He read the message twice, then looked toward the quiet skyline outside his window, where Earth's sun continued shining warmly, exactly as it always had. They wanted to buy our star, he murmured to himself. Now they'll learn it was never truly for sale. He gathered his things, preparing once again to face the full weight of the galaxy, this time from a position Earth had never held before. The assembly chamber had never been so loud. Daniel Reyes stepped through the tall entrance doors and immediately felt the weight of hundreds of alien eyes, sensors, and unfamiliar sensory organs turning toward him at once. Unlike the quiet, almost dismissive atmosphere of the earlier sessions, this time the room buzzed with tense conversation, sharp gestures, and nervous energy that even a human unfamiliar with most alien body language could easily recognize as fear disguised as anger. He walked calmly to the human delegation's designated seating area, doing his best to project confidence he did not entirely feel. Beside him, two fellow diplomats exchanged uneasy glances, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden shift in how the rest of the galaxy now viewed their small, previously unremarkable species. At the center of the chamber, the presiding officer of the assembly, an ancient, multi-limbed being known for its calm neutrality during disputes, called the session to order. Its voice, translated smoothly into hundreds of different languages simultaneously, echoed through the massive room. "We are gathered today," it announced, "to address an unprecedented event. The human species, holding no formal ownership of its star, has nonetheless denied access to that star from its rightful legal claimant, the Harrow Combine, using previously unknown technology. This body must determine an appropriate response." A representative from the Harrow Combine rose immediately, its usual smooth, confident tone replaced with barely restrained frustration. "This is not merely a dispute," it said sharply. "This is theft, sabotage, a direct attack against our legally purchased property and the ships sent to secure it. We demand immediate intervention, full restoration of access, and appropriate compensation for damages caused." Murmurs spread through the chamber as other delegates whispered among themselves, some clearly sympathetic to the Combine's outrage, others visibly intrigued, even quietly impressed, by what Earth had managed to accomplish. Daniel rose to speak, waiting patiently for the chamber to settle before beginning. "With respect," he said, his voice steady and clear, "Earth has committed no theft and no sabotage. Every satellite involved in this situation was built entirely by human hands, using human resources, launched from human territory, and operated exclusively within our own solar system. We have simply chosen how to manage infrastructure that belongs to us. The Harrow Combine representative interrupted sharply. The star itself belongs to us, purchased legally through proper assembly channels. And yet, Daniel replied calmly, your own charter states clearly that any claimed resource must remain safely and practically accessible to its rightful owner. Nowhere does it require that a species allow unrestricted, unregulated access to infrastructure they themselves designed, built, and maintain. If a claimed resource requires infrastructure to access, and that infrastructure belongs to someone else entirely, surely the owner of that infrastructure retains some rights over its use. The chamber fell into an uneasy silence. Several older delegates exchanged uncertain glances, clearly recognizing the uncomfortable legal complexity Daniel had just introduced. If Earth's argument was accepted, it would set an unusual precedent, one that other young, developing species scattered throughout the galaxy might eventually use to defend their own systems from similar claims in the future. A representative from a mineral trading species Daniel did not immediately recognize spoke up cautiously. If this argument holds, any species controlling access infrastructure to a resource, regardless of formal ownership status, could effectively deny use to its legal claimant. This could disrupt countless existing trade agreements across the galaxy. Whispers of concern spread further through the chamber, some delegates clearly worried about the wider implications, others quietly excited by the possibility of similar leverage over their own disputes. The presiding officer raised a limb, calling for order once again. This body will require formal review of the legal argument presented. However, immediate practical matters must first be addressed. The Harrow Combine has confirmed significant losses among its enforcement fleet, currently stranded near Earth's solar system. The combined representative's composure slipped visibly. We demand those vessels be released immediately, along with full restoration of solar access. Daniel glanced briefly toward the small screen resting discreetly near his seat, where a private, encrypted message from Grace Okafor had just appeared, confirming that Earth's defensive fleet remained fully prepared and positioned, ready to respond firmly to any attempt at forced intervention. Earth is prepared to discuss a reasonable resolution, Daniel said carefully. However, any attempt to force access through military action will be met accordingly. We do not wish for further conflict, but we will not simply return to a position where our own star can be taken from us without our consent. The chamber buzzed louder, delegates debating openly now, some urging caution, others demanding stronger action against what they viewed as dangerous, destabilizing behavior from an inexperienced species. It was at this point that a soft, calm voice cut through the noise, transmitted remotely from Earth and displayed on a large screen positioned above the central stage. Helen Marsh appeared, her expression composed despite the enormous audience watching her. She had been called earlier to provide technical testimony regarding the exact nature of the technology involved, and though clearly uncomfortable speaking before such an audience, she remained steady. I helped design the system currently protecting our solar output, she said simply. It was never built as a weapon, nor as a tool for aggression. It was built because history, even the limited history our species has learned from your own galaxy, taught us that dependence without protection often leads to exploitation. She paused briefly, looking directly into the camera, addressing the chamber as clearly as if she stood before them in person. The sun was never truly for sale, she said. Only humanity's patience was, and even that has limits. Her words lingered in the sudden quiet that followed, translated instantly into countless alien languages, spreading through the chamber with unexpected weight. The presiding officer allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. This body will adjourn to review the legal precedent presented and to determine an appropriate path forward. Given the unusual circumstances and the clear military stalemate currently in place, immediate action against Earth is neither advisable nor supported by sufficient consensus at this time. The Harrow Combine representative looked visibly furious, though it said nothing further, clearly recognizing that pushing harder in this moment risked losing whatever remaining support it still held among other delegates. As the session ended and delegates slowly began filing out, Daniel remained seated for a moment, watching the chamber empty around him. For the first time since this entire crisis began, He allowed himself to feel something closer to quiet confidence, rather than simple defiance. Word of the session spread rapidly across galactic networks, sparking intense debate among species who had never previously questioned the authority of the Assembly's ownership system. Some worried aloud about the dangerous precedent Earth had introduced. Others quietly admired a young species willing to stand firm against long-established rules many had simply accepted without question. Back on Earth, Grace Okafor received a short, simple message from Daniel following the session's conclusion. "They're scared," it read. "Not of losing the argument. Scared of losing control." Grace allowed herself a small, satisfied nod as she read it, glancing briefly toward the quiet, steady status lights confirming Earth's continued readiness. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Earth was no longer simply reacting to the galaxy's decisions. It was shaping them. 3 weeks of tense negotiation followed the emergency assembly session, and by the end of it, Daniel Reyes had grown so used to sitting in cramped diplomatic meeting rooms that he sometimes forgot what sunlight looked like outside a viewport window. The Trade Assembly, faced with a legal argument it could not easily dismiss, and a military standoff it had no clear way to win without risking wider instability, found itself trapped in an uncomfortable position. Earth's technology had proven effective enough to strand an entire enforcement fleet without firing a single weapon. Its legal argument, though unusual, held enough merit to threaten existing trade agreements across dozens of other species if left unresolved. And perhaps most concerning of all, other young, developing civilizations scattered throughout the galaxy had begun quietly reaching out to Earth's diplomatic representatives, curious, hopeful, and in some cases openly inspired by what humanity had managed to accomplish. The Assembly could not risk allowing that curiosity to spread further. Behind closed doors, private negotiations moved quickly, far more quickly than Daniel had expected given how slowly the Assembly typically handled disputes. Representatives from several older, more established species, worried about setting off similar defiance among other developing civilizations under their own influence, quietly pressured the Harrow Combine toward compromise. The Combine, embarrassed by its stranded fleet and increasingly uncomfortable with the widespread attention its failed enforcement attempt had drawn, ultimately agreed to a resolution designed to save face on all sides. Rather than admitting outright defeat, the Assembly announced that a formal review of galactic property law had revealed a procedural oversight in the original sale, one significant enough to invalidate the Harrow Combine's claim entirely. Daniel almost laughed when he first read the official statement. The very same type of paperwork loophole that had cost Earth its star in the first place was now being used, conveniently, to hand it back. They needed a way to reverse this without looking weak, Grace observed during a private call following the announcement. So they invented one. "As long as it works," Daniel replied. "I don't particularly care how convenient the excuse is." With the original sale formally nullified, Earth's diplomatic team pushed immediately for something far more important than simply reversing a single mistake. They demanded full, permanent recognition of human sovereignty over Earth's solar system, along with a broader review of the very loophole that had allowed the star to be sold without proper notification in the first place. Negotiations over these terms proved difficult. Several older species resisted the idea of granting full sovereignty status to a species as young as humanity, worried it might encourage similar demands from other developing civilizations eager to escape long-standing trade obligations of their own. Daniel remained firm throughout, drawing on the same careful, patient argument style that had served Earth well during the emergency session weeks earlier. "You do not have to like the precedent," he told one particularly resistant delegate during a private meeting. "But you cannot ignore that it already exists. Earth has already demonstrated it can defend what belongs to it. The only question remaining is whether that defense happens peacefully, through agreement, or through continued instability none of us actually want." Eventually, after weeks of careful pressure, exhausting negotiation, and more than a few long nights fueled entirely by strong coffee and stronger determination, the Assembly formally agreed to Earth's terms. Human sovereignty over its home solar system was recognized, officially and permanently, within galactic law. A formal review process was also approved, aimed at closing the very loophole that had allowed Earth's star to be sold without its knowledge in the first place. A small but meaningful step that Daniel hoped might protect other young species from facing a similar crisis in the future. News of the agreement reached Earth quickly, spreading across every major news network within hours. Celebrations broke out in cities across the planet, people gathering in public squares, cheering, laughing, embracing strangers, united by a shared sense of relief and pride that had not existed so strongly since humanity's very first contact with alien life decades earlier. In the Colorado facility, Helen Marsh watched the celebrations unfold across news broadcasts with a quiet, tired smile. Beside her, several members of her long-standing team allowed themselves a rare moment of celebration, sharing a simple meal together, much like they had during the earliest, most uncertain days of the project so many years earlier. "We did it," one young engineer said softly, almost in disbelief. Helen nodded, though her mind drifted briefly to the 10 difficult years that had led to this single moment. "We didn't just protect a star," she said quietly. "We proved something far more important. Being young does not mean being powerless." Grace Okafor, watching from her command station as Earth's defensive fleet slowly stood down from its highest alert status, allowed herself a similar sense of quiet satisfaction. She had spent years preparing for a fight she hoped would never truly happen, and though it had come dangerously close, Earth had emerged from it stronger, more respected, and far more united than before. A final assembly session was called shortly afterward, largely ceremonial in nature, meant to formally close the matter and welcome Earth's officially recognized sovereignty. Daniel stood once more at the podium, addressing a chamber that looked at him now with noticeably more respect than it had during that very first, humiliating meeting weeks earlier. "We did not come here seeking conflict," he said, his voice steady and calm. "We do not wish to challenge the galaxy or disrupt the systems many of you have relied upon for generations. We simply refuse to be treated as something that can be owned, dismissed, or taken advantage of, simply because we are new to this stage." He paused, glancing briefly toward the quiet, steady image of Earth's sun displayed on a nearby screen, its light shining as warmly and consistently as it always had. "Humanity does not want to fight the galaxy," he continued. "We only ask to be treated as equals within it." Far above Earth, spread silently across millions of kilometers of space, the massive satellite array that had once stood ready to block sunlight from an approaching enemy fleet now opened fully once more, allowing sunlight to flow freely outward in every direction, exactly as it always had before the crisis began. The sun continued shining, warm and steady, over a species that had proven, against every expectation placed upon it, that it could not simply be bought, sold, or pushed aside. For the first time since humanity's earliest steps into the wider galaxy, Earth stood not as a nervous newcomer hoping simply to be tolerated, but as a civilization finally, firmly, recognized as an equal among the stars. And far below, on a quiet street somewhere in a small human city, children played happily beneath a bright, familiar sky, entirely unaware of just how close they had come to losing it, and entirely unaware of just how hard so many people had fought quietly to make sure they never would.